Welcome grade 7s. Today we're going to look at the transatlantic slave trade. My arrows are slightly off over here. It involved taking slaves from West Africa, and slavery had already begun in West Africa before the Americans started deciding to ship in some slaves. So the slaves would travel from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean up to North America. We're going to refer to these areas as American South because it only involves the South American countries. Well, the North American continent, but the countries that are in the southern parts of America. And in this area, they would work on farms and plantations. They would work on cotton fields and things like that. Cotton fields, tobacco fields, rice fields, sugarcane fields. They would make things and the produce they'd send across to the Europeans. The Europeans would make use of this raw material and they would produce other goods which would then be traded again in different areas. Okay, let's have a quick read through this. The transatlantic slave trade involved slaves being transported from West Africa to the American South across the Atlantic Ocean. West Africa was trading slaves among themselves before they started trading slaves with Europe. It mainly took place in farming societies in West Africa. The European settlers in the American South set up big plantations and imported slaves from West Africa to do the manual labor, the hard work. European traders exchanged goods for slaves with the African kings. When the slaves reached America, they were sold at slave markets. Now, the reason that the Europeans would trade with the Africans is because in Europe, the farmland was not good enough for them to have all these plantations. The environment was not conducive to all this farming. So they used the American soil to do their hard labor and things like that. All right, so the Europeans actually headed up all of this. The slave trade had a negative effect on the West African societies, but it improved the American and European economy. Now, why did it have a negative effect on the African countries? And that would be because they wouldn't want old people working on the plantations. So they would take the young, strong, hard-working people from Africa to work on these plantations, which meant that the African areas were left with either children or old people to head up those farms and those areas and those communities, which didn't leave them with a good group of people. Okay, so that is why it impacted them negatively. Now, please have a look at page 72 and let's read through that. Actually, at the top you can see that there's a word bank. Now, you should have taken all the words from this section from page 72 up until, let's just have a quick look here, from page 72 up until page 93, and you should have done your word bank at the back of your book already. If that hasn't been done, please ensure that it gets done as soon as possible. All right, so let's read through this. The nature of slavery in West Africa before Europeans. Slavery has happened in almost every single society in history of the world. Slavery existed for centuries in West Africa, long before contact with Europeans. Now, within West African societies, slavery took place in West Africa farming societies on a small scale. Farming societies needed a lot of labor, and many farming communities could not produce enough food to survive. Poor families sometimes gave one of their children as a slave to a rich family in exchange for food. Very poor farmers sometimes agreed to work for a wealthy neighbor in exchange for food and housing, etc. Now, The Trans-Saharan slave trade. As you learned in topic 2, there were slave trade routes across the Sahara Desert. All right. Africans were captured and sent on a slave camel caravans across the Sahara to the Arabic Islam world. Some enslaved Africans reached Europe, the Middle East, and other parts of the world from the 7th century. A long-distance slave trade took many millions of Africans across the Sahara Desert. Now let's have a look at the source. This source A, this extract describes how slavery existed for a long time. Slavery existed in West Africa before European traders arrived. Africans were also involved in a trans-Saharan trade in slaves. Many Africans made enormous wealth and increased their power as a result of the trade of their fellow Africans. All right, now the whole slavery history that we are going to learn about, it is very sad. Many people were taken away from their families. Many families had to sacrifice their children in order so that they could survive. And many families were torn apart because some of them were captured and then sent across and displaced and sent to other countries. On that for now, and then we will continue. You've got 10 minutes to do that. Please, once you've written your heading, you do question 1A, B, and C. Answer that, rule off, and then leave a line, do question 2A, B, and C. Please ensure that you're working neatly and that your work is laid out well. In history and geography, we do 1 activity per page. Our books are big enough, and that way we can do our corrections below your activity. Thank you.